Hello and welcome to Gabbitt Media. I'm Gabbitt, and today I'm going to talk about how I made the card dealer cart or caravan, which you can see here. This is for the work that I'm doing for Atlas Empires. This will be a commentary of how I built it and painted it, with lots of tips and tricks along the way. I'll be linking to playlists and other videos which have more detailed versions of what I'm going through. So look out for the cards in the corner and the links in the description. So you can see for this one I actually brought some reference images in, and the concept art was quite detailed for this, and it had the side view, front view, back view, so that was really useful. And I made a slight mistake here, so I set up my box so it would give me the sort of location of my object, and then I could set up the reference images around that, but I should have pushed them backwards because it was actually difficult to work around my reference images. That's the difference between the 2.79 and 2.8 reference images, is that you can actually have them in your scene as objects and you can move them around. And it would have been much better if I just pushed them backwards so they weren't overlapping my object, as you can see here. It took me a long time this is actually sped up to 15 times, so 1,500%. So you can get an idea about how long this whole project took me. I'm not sure why this one took so much longer. It might be because I'm actually using the reference image like this, so I'm being a bit more precise, which isn't really necessary. It doesn't have to be exactly like the concept art. And usually I can get very close to just by eye and having it on a separate screen, as it were. But for some reason it seemed to take a long time. I'm very pleased with how it came out, and I really did like the concept art as well. I mean, I've enjoyed the concept art all the way through, but this one seemed extra special, and I really wanted to work hard on it to make it look a lot like the concept art, and as close as I possibly could. I'm still doing the model in the same way as always, so I'm overlapping objects and repeating objects where I can, so it's sort of a modular approach. I'm still using a small UV map, so it's 512 by 512. I actually paint on a 1024 by 1024 texture, but it's then reduced to a 512. And I do have to bear that in mind. Any sort of tiny details where I'm starting to get a bit of pixelation in my image, I know that's not really going to come out that well, so I have to watch out for those sort of things. But you can see I'm going around. It's difficult to see actually because it's all in wireframe and I'm seeing through my object so I can see the background. But you can sort of see it coming together, and it's all just separate objects. It's quite simplistic really, but it is time consuming putting it all together. And I suppose there's a lot more detail in this cart than there have been in the other assets that I've done, especially the sort of modelling sets. They're a bit more simplistic. They're still time consuming because there's a lot of them, but for some reason this one took me longer than some of the sets did, which I'm still not sure how that happened, but I think I spent a lot of time on the painting for this one. I was just really getting into it and really enjoying it, and maybe I'll use it as a portfolio piece if they'll let me, so I had that in the back of my mind as well. I always want to put as much effort as I possibly can into every piece of contract work that I get, so I know that the clients are happy and I feel like I've done the best I possibly can with that project. And you sort of learn more and grow as an artist that way. But for some reason this one I really went for it in a huge way. I'm not sure quite what happened there. It was very nice actually when I sent this off because all my work gets reviewed, so I put it into this sort of the pool, as it were, and it gets looked at and reviewed. But they were really complimentary about this and said that it looks fantastic. And it's nice to get that sort of feedback as well. It does make a massive difference when you're getting feedback and it's really positive like that. It makes you just enjoy your work more, doesn't it? Now, generally speaking, when I'm modelling, I'm thinking about the separate objects, obviously, but things like the middle of the cabin, I treat it as three planes, so the outside of the cabin as three different planes, rather than having a box in the middle and building around a box. I tend to build up things with planes. That makes it easier for texturing because I can separate the items easily, and things like unwrapping, you don't have to go into so much detail, it's quite easy to cut up. I still got a few questions about the kit that I'm using. I do have a video on that. The only difference to the video where it talks about my setup or my kit, I can't remember what it's called, is that I've got a 1070 graphics card that was kindly donated to me. But it doesn't really need that much processing power when you're doing mobile assets, and that's quite a nice thing really. For the painting, I use my Wacom Mobile Studio Pro, and that is a fairly expensive piece of kit, but it really is nice to be able to draw on the screen. I think a display tablet for the work that I do is kind of essential, really. And extrusions that are coming inwards, as soon as you mirror it, it sort of changes the properties in a sense, and you don't get an even circle. So you can see here I delay the mirror when I'm doing this sort of circular objects until I've got the rough shape, and then I do the final mirror. Because the mirror is quite important to me because it allows me to take up only half the texture space. So especially across my model, so from side to side, I'll often mirror. But up and down, that's more difficult because generally speaking, you have your higher things up lighter, you paint them a bit lighter, and the lower things darker. Because the lower things tend to have sort of more ambient occlusion where they're in crevices and things, or not getting as much light. And the top things, of course, where the sunlight's coming from. And you generally, when you're painting, you're thinking about 12 o'clock shadows, so as if the sun's right over the top of the object. And that helps with mirroring as well because you can have the highlights right in the top center, and it makes it a bit easier. So you can see I'm keeping very close to the original artwork, as much as possible anyway. You can see there that I'm cutting sections out as well. It does create more topology, but again it helps me with my texture maps, and I've learnt that whilst going along, that the company aren't as worried about how many polygons there are, but I know that it's going to be tough when it comes to the texture space if I don't reduce the texture surface area as much as possible. So where possible, I will actually go in and cut things out. And like I say, that can actually create more polygons because you're sort of creating cuts in things. But generally speaking, it's much more efficient for me as an artist, so I've got that texture space to work with. Now you can see in here, there's a really tiny sliver of a gap, and that's really awkward as an artist actually, and you don't want those areas. So I'm trying to kind of minimize that area a bit where I can. But again, I want to keep as close to the concept art as possible. So I don't worry too much about it, but it's hard to get, for instance, your brush in there, and it's kind of wasted space as well because you end up just painting black because it's so crevicey, if that's the right word, that you can't get in there. So it's kind of wasted space, and it doesn't quite work when you're texturing. You can see there I check every now and again the face direction. Occasionally when you copy things across or flip them and mirror them, especially when you're working with planes, you often have the wrong face direction, so you have to flip it round, or occasionally scale it to the other side if you're mirroring. That's a common problem when people are painting. They're saying it's not turning up on my object, or it's coming out on the wrong side. That's just your faces are flipped. I think this was the only part that I actually box modelled, as it were, rather than sort of plane modelled. And then I actually cut it up eventually in the end. I tend to prefer my objects all separate, and I can methodically go through them painting rather than painting it all in one go. I think maybe that's just me and it's my preference, but it's just easier for my headspace to think of objects all separately. So you can see there I'm creating that model, and in fact I assume I mirror it later on, but I do all the modelling first and then mirror afterwards. It would make sense to mirror that one anyway. But you can also see how this model's slowly coming together. I'm having to sort of figure things out because I can't see all the cart, and I think I've missed the tiny bit looking back. There's a tiny bit there where there's a ball on the back, I think maybe a sort of mystic's or fortune teller's ball, and I never actually put that in. Circles are really awkward for a texture painter who's doing low poly because they do take up a lot of space. You can see the cartwheels, they're quite high poly really, but I knew if I made them any more low poly than that you'd start to see the edges and it wouldn't look circular. So I took a bit of a risk there and thought, well, I haven't used up loads of polys in this shape. I'll make this a little bit more high poly. The cartwheel supports, as they are, they're all linked duplicates, so that's Alt-D to link the duplicates, so I'll only need to paint one. There's a bit of a risk there because obviously some are higher than others, so some should be slightly lighter than others, but you can kind of get away with it, and I think that works with my final model, and that's not too much of a problem. So by this point I'm fairly happy with the shape. I'm just sort of tidying things up and making sure the curves are there and trying to reduce the polys. If you see what I'm doing, I'm snapping the vertices, so GG to edge slider vertices and snap it into another one, and make sure you've got auto merge on, and that will get rid of that extra polygon. And that's what I tend to do more towards the end, is just sort of tidy up, go around the object, make sure it's all fitting in nicely and working together. Where I need to, I duplicate objects. I made a bit of a mistake there because it was a linked duplicate, and then I edited the shape, and then it edited the other side because it's linked. And that's what you have to watch out for. If it's a linked duplicate and you go into edit mode and you change the shape, it will edit all the other ones. That's the same for adding a mirror as well. So if you add a modifier to it, it doesn't add the modifier to the other ones. You have to actually specifically go into each of the other ones, and you can link them up. You can link modifiers with Control L to link objects, and then you click the modifier option. So you can just sort of link up the modifiers again if you've mirrored it already. So it has this funny sort of card thing on the top. I'm not texturing that yet. I've got to leave a texture space for that because I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work in the game, and they've got to sort of test a few things out there. So I'm assuming it's going to show the cards, but it might just have to show a sort of generic card-ish thing on the top there. So we've still got to work that one out. Here I'm tidying the space up so the faces don't overlap too much. That doesn't really affect the game processing power or anything like that, but it does affect the texture space that I use. So if it's taking up texture space and it's not going to be used, it's kind of pointless. Now you can see me going around marking the seams, and I really just mark them in obvious positions. So where there's a deep crevice, I'll cut it up. Where there's a corner, I'll cut it up. You don't have to worry too much. Because it's texture painted, you're not going to see any ugly seams anywhere, generally speaking, because the computer's working it all out when you're texture painting, so that's easy enough for it. But what you will want to do is make sure your texture spaces are relatively even, so they're not taking up a huge amount of space or going around a corner or anything like that. So you don't want, you want sort of flat, squarish objects as far as you can in your UV space. And ideally you don't want sort of big curves and things. Sometimes you have to. I think for the wheels they sort of unwrap in a curve, but those are the sort of only things that you want to have it in a curve, because obviously they don't fit together very easily. There are lots of plugins for unwrapping and UV editing, and Packmaster is one of them that I've looked at, but actually in a strange way I like to have a bit of free texture space just in case I make a mistake, because it's very awkward to rebake your whole object if you have to re-unwrap. It's not impossible, but it's just awkward. So I'm finally getting ready to set up for texture painting here, and setting up the texture, making sure everything's alright, putting my reference image in the shot there. I tend to have it on the other screen as well, but I actually had lots of other reference images as well as this one on the other screen, so it was kind of handy to have it there. So the first thing I do is I fill in the colours, and I thought actually with this one it was fairly complicated, so I decided to eventually go around and fill in all the shapes with their sort of base colour, and that way in this sort of flat shading that I've got, they wouldn't sort of be distracting and they'd sort of work together. And at times as well you want your colours to not be too distinct, so not too saturated, so you copy the saturation from one colour to, or one area of colour to another. Unless you want to really highlight a bit, like the windows obviously are more saturated, more bright, so they stand out. The technique is the same for each model that I come across, so I do the base colour first, so I use the fill brush and fill it in. Then I tend to go around and mix the colour really slightly, so on a very faint strength brush I'll just go around and dab in lots of different colours, and you can see lots of these tutorials in more depth in the playlist that is in the description. So I'll go in and I will just dab on those different colours, lots of variation of colours, just to give it so everything has a reflective quality, so the environment around it, I'm imagining that there's lots of colours in that environment and they're sort of bouncing off and reflecting. And objects generally have a lot of different colours within them. So if you use your colour picker on a photograph and you go to an area of wood, for example, and you just pick lots of colours out of it, you can see the difference and variety in those colours. So it's a good idea to start off with, before you do any detail painting, just to give it a splattering of colour that's very close to each other, generally speaking, and very light in strength is the easy way. But that just gives you a starting point, and at that point, then you go for your detail. So you can still see I'm going around filling in the colours, getting these blocks out as best I can, and now I'm starting to do exactly as I said. So I'm filling in random colours for this wood, then I fill in the crevices. So I treat it as if I'm sketching. So with sketching you're using a pencil, which is the dark colours, so you're always painting in the shade and leaving out the light bits. So I start off as if I'm sketching out the outlines of the shape. So those are the crevices and the shadows, as it were. Once I've done those sort of shadows, that's when I paint in the highlights. So where there's a shadow, often there's a little ridge or a sort of jotting out bit that will catch the light, and it will wear fast another bit, so edges, corners, and those will all be my highlights. And for that I'll use a screen brush. Generally speaking, I'll use a screen brush and paint in those highlights. Now on this bit I've actually painted a separate colour on the same object, and that's rare for me to do that. I tend to actually separate the objects out just because it's a little bit easier to paint in that way, and also it's much easier to sort of recolour if you have to. So because they're all separate objects, I can use the fill brush with the blend paintbrush mode, or the blend mode as it's called for your brush. I can change that across the colour, bring the strength down a bit and just dab in a little bit of colour, and that will bring the colours close to each other, and I do a bit of that towards the end. For every piece of work that I do and every new set that I do, I try and experiment just a touch, and I look at new reference images, so it's not sort of the same old tired reference images. I've actually got a huge big pure ref image that goes really detailed, but I'm picking up new reference images all the time and trying to learn that bit more, because this is as much about my growth as an artist as it is as getting the job done, for me anyway. That's all important. I want to be the best artist I can possibly be, so constantly looking at reference images. If I struggle with any pieces, and one of the things that I often struggle with is metal. I find that very hard to paint because metal is often all about the reflections. So without any reflection maps and HDRIs in the background and that sort of thing, you have to kind of paint that on. So it's quite a difficult thing to do. So I'm often looking at how other artists have approached that, how have they got that look and that detail. I've noticed actually with metal that it's often the highlights are just much more bright and much thinner, depending on how shiny it is. The shinier it is, the narrower the highlights and the brighter the highlights. From my experience so far, I would say the most important things to know how to paint are rocks and wood and metal. I know it sounds a bit obvious and silly, but if you can paint those, you can pretty much do all the work that I'm doing here. There's obviously going to be a few bits which are different to that, and there's going to be colour variations to that and everything, but generally speaking, that's what I've found. Now you can see I'm going in and adding bits of detail and trying to make these pieces look a bit more individual and kind of full of character. And that's been quite fun actually. I've sort of developed that over time, slowly figuring out how much I can put in that doesn't detract from the object and draw the eye too much, but just gives it, like I say, that bit of character and that sort of realism in a stylized way. The problem I have when I'm adding those bits of character and that style is that if I've mirrored the object, or if I've got lots of iterations, so lots of linked duplicates of that object that are sharing the same UV map, they will look exactly the same. So any bit of character that you put in is going to be duplicated, and then you can suddenly see all the duplications. So I keep that to a bit of a minimum when there's a set that has lots of those sort of things. But for this, it was great fun because there wasn't too much of that, so I could really go to town with the highlights and character, and it was really enjoyable. You can see there that I did a colour change, so the wood at the top there had a sort of reddy colour, and I used that blend mode, that colour blend mode, to change the colours and experiment with the colours. I'm really enjoying that brush. I think it's really fantastic, that blend mode anyway, that you can do that with. Here I'm doing the windows, and you can see to make the windows sort of or look like there's light inside, you have to paint a bit of light onto all the surrounding objects. So you go back to each of those and just dab in a bit of bright yellow, and it seems to work quite well. The only tricky bit I had when I was doing the other bits was to try and match up that yellow colour. It's surprisingly hard, and even though I'm doing a colour pick there, you can see it just doesn't quite match up, but I get there in the end, but it took me a little bit of time. So it's a bit tricky when you're coming to the dark crevice spots, but there's light shining on them, and you sort of wonder how far to go, and that's sort of a slightly new thing for me, using or painting in the light rather than using something like Cycles where you have an emission node and it just does it for you. So here I'm trying to paint in the light, so I'm doing all the work of the lighting rather than relying on lights in my scene. And so the hard bit there was thinking, well, this bit would normally be in shade, but the light is obviously shining from this angle this time. And often I'm just thinking about, well, the light's coming from the top, the higher bits are slightly brighter than the lower bits, so it's easy to paint. But when you're thinking about light coming from the different directions of the object, then it got a bit tougher, and I had to have my thinking cap on. So every now and again, of course, the same thing, I'm changing from my principal psdf to an emission node. So I've got the Node Wrangler add-on, and I press Control Shift left click on my texture, and then I can see the texture nice and flat. Lots of people have been suggesting other ways. I just find that the quickest and the easiest. So that's the way I've been doing it. I think sometimes it's just what you're used to. Even if it's a longer process, if you're used to it, it can actually be quicker than learning something new. Now you might have noticed I had to unwrap something once again, so I made a slight mistake in the unwrap and it was stretched. So when I was painting on it, I noticed it was going very pixelated. So I went into the texture, and that's where it's really helpful to have just a tiny bit of extra texture space to play with, so you can move things around and not disrupt everything. If it was really closely packed, I'd find it very difficult. So although it feels like a waste overall, and there will be a fair bit of texture space wasted, it's kind of unavoidable in the workflow. But if I didn't do that, I would be rebaking, and it would just take way too long to do the whole thing. So a tiny bit of wasted texture space is really useful in case there's any errors like that and I have to re-unwrap. In that case, I just take that one object, press unwrap, and then move the UVs into position. And that's fine, I can move them around and slot them in. I have to select everything else to see where their UVs are. Unless it's already been painted, then I can see them. But if there's lots of blank texture space, then it could be that other UVs are using that area. I've got lots of tutorials on UV unwrapping if you need to know more about that. I haven't got many for 2.8 yet, but I'll get around to that. Do make sure you comment below with any questions that you have. I'm trying to get through the questions. Some of them I don't actually know what the answer is. So some of them are about the optimization when it's sent off to the game dev people. I'm unsure myself, but I'll try and find out where I can, and I'll try and remember your questions as well. Sometimes I'm not in a place I can sort of copy and paste those comments to remind myself to mention them in the next video. But the more they come up, the more I'll remember. So I need your help there, if you don't mind. That's for anybody that gets this far. I know that this is quite a long video, really. Even sped up 15 times, it's still a long video. So I'd be surprised if people are still with me. It's always nice to know that people are. So if you can write a comment, "I'm still with you, Grant," that really does brighten my day when I see those comments. It's nice to know the efforts of this part of the video are still coming through. Now for this one, I don't think I had a mirror on it, which is quite rare for me. So I think what I did was I didn't put a mirror on so I could add more character across the shape, and that was the thinking behind this. I made a slight mistake here. Where the highlight is, I didn't go to the principal BSDF, so I put it in the wrong place, because it's quite hard to see where the edges are when you're doing this sort of flat shading painting. And those who've done a bit of this will know what I mean. So it's in the wrong place, so I'll have to go back to that later. For some of the wood, I actually just painted it its usual colour and then used that sort of blend colour mode and just went over it with a different colour. And that seemed quite effective. Although for this one I decided to actually try out using the actual blue colour, or variations of the blue colour anyway, and see what it would look like. And it works quite nicely, so I just sort of stuck with that after this. But it's nice to have that colour brush. I keep going on about it, but it's really nice to just have that option so you can change colours really easily. So if the designers say, actually, can we have that in a red, I can just go in with that colour brush, especially when it's a separate object or a separate seamed area, it's easy to highlight and just change that colour. And that's something to think about when you're marking your seams. Do you have sort of objects which are touching each other in the same object? So let's say you've got a barrel and it's got a metal bit and a wooden bit. Sometimes I like to separate them, but you can just mark a seam around them, and then you can go into edit mode, select just the seamed area, and then go back to paint mode and isolate that area. Experimenting with the windows a bit. It's got a mirror on, so I can't add any highlights very easily, otherwise the highlights go in different directions. But you can see the concept art has those nice sort of streaky shines on it, and I wanted to mimic that, but I couldn't. I could do them up and down, but if I do them across, they obviously mirror, so they don't both go across in the same direction, which won't make any sense and it will look odd. I get round that later on by thinking I'll actually add in some lattices on the windows, so that sort of leaded window look, and I'm quite pleased I did that. I think it looks really great, so I think it's a nice addition to the concept art, so a sort of new idea. And Chris is quite happy for me to, he seems really pleased with my art, which is great, and he's quite happy for me to take it in a slightly new direction if I need to. So you can see me painting the lattices in here, and they look quite fun. I changed the window slightly, that sort of gives them, changed the highlights slightly, and that gives them that sort of warped window look, because those old lead windows, the glass is sort of handmade for each section, and it's wobbly and warped and all sorts. It's lucky in England we've got lots of those nice old buildings around the place, so I get to see lots of reference images like that. You can see I had problems there as well. I unwrapped it badly, so I had to go to the corners where they were stretched and it was pixelating. And you can see I select everything so I can see where the UVs are and reposition it, and it's fine. I go a bit quicker on the pieces that you can't see so well. So these bottom pieces down here, I just quickly slap on a texture, a bit rougher this time, but it's in the shadow a lot, so you don't have to worry too much. And then I start working on those bits that I might be able to see a bit easier. So here's some metal, and you can see that I'm painting it quite dark to start off with, and that will make the highlights stand out that bit more. Obviously this is in a fair bit of shade anyway, so it's quite dark, but can you see the highlights, although they're actually a little bit pixelated in this, so I'm going to the edge of the extreme of how far I can go with the texture map, but those highlights are quite pronounced compared to the rest of the object, and that makes it look a bit like metal anyway. I think I'll go back to them in a minute and dull them down slightly because they look too bright in the position that they're in. So because it's in the shade slightly, you can't have them that bright. You can have very small parts quite bright as if they're catching the light, but if too much of it's catching the light, it doesn't make sense. The same for the wood, so right at the end of the wood it will catch the light, especially on this model because that's the bit that's jutting out. So I go in and give that a sort of white fleck around the edge. So much of it is quite repetitive. It's kind of a long process. Some people were asking whether I would use templates and have sort of wooded template and then paint over it. I suppose I could do that, but I would actually probably find it just as long because I would have to go in and edit it after the fact. So I'd have to use the template and then go back and then sort of blur the edges where the template was overlapping itself and things. And generally speaking, it can be just as quick going this way. It might be a tiny bit quicker with a template perhaps, but there is the time sort of setting up those templates, getting them ready, putting them in position. I'm not sure there's much time to be saved. There possibly is, but in a way I'm kind of enjoying this because I'm developing as an artist. Each time I paint a piece of wood, I get better at painting wood. It sounds odd that I would sort of force myself to do this, but I do often treat this as development as well as work. So in all the work that I do, I like to develop as an artist. So painting the wood, if it's not going to save much time doing a sort of stencil, then I will hand paint it for the practice. Even though I've painted wood a lot of times now, I still feel like there's more to be learnt. I actually looked up a few cartwheels and figured out that that's how they do it. They sort of separate the wood out and they bend it round, so it's got separate areas for the wood. It's not just one big, huge round piece of wood, which wouldn't obviously exist. The cartwheel was kind of interesting because it's got that metal outside, so a bit of a highlight on there and highlight around the edges, and it seemed to work well. So there we have it, the final finished piece. Yeah, like I say, I'm really pleased with this one. I think it came out really well. And like I say, I think I am developing as an artist, getting better all the time, so I'm really pleased. Do put any comments below about what you'd like to see, or whether you'd like me to change the format of the way I'm doing this and showing this, because they are quite long videos really. So I hope you are still enjoying it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.